And again, welcome to Relevance Series. Hope you all be ready to listen to today's message. And my name is Bing Yuan. I'm a fifth year studying in economics. It's such an opportunity for me to able to do this. And the Relevance Series, it's at University of Toronto. It's an outreach from January 12th to 19th, 2024. We collaborate with several Christian campus fellowships and organizations. We want to promote positive dialogues and enable students who do not yet know the Lord and see the relevance of Jesus for all of life. We will have speakers thoughtfully discussing and answering questions about culture, science, and identity. And also, we do have this, we do live together with the First Nations. So as a Christian organizer of this event, we believe all land and all people are created by God. We want to acknowledge that the land on which U of T lies is a traditional territory of Wendat and Nabak Nation and Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nations and the Métis Nation. We thank these first people who come to live on this land and care for them, and whose relationship to this land exists long before the founding of Canada. We're grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. And we do have a follow-up form. That will be, this opportunity is prepared for you to give your comments and feedbacks to us. And they are very important for us to improve in the future. And it will be through a QR code showing on the screen after this message. And we are having an amazing speaker today. We are so grateful for having Logan Gates. He is a PhD candidate in political theory at U of T, studying Christianity's roles in shaping the modern idea of human rights. He is also an adjunct speaker with Apologetics Canada and has spoken on tough questions about Christian faith on university campuses across Canada over the past several years. And he likes to drink tea and running a lot, even in this cold winter. And now, let's give our warmest welcome to our speaker for today, Logan Gates.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. All right. Well, good afternoon. My name is Logan. As Ben said, I'm a PhD student here at U of T. I'm in the political science department, and I am studying political theory. But I'm really excited to wrestle with this question with you today. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving your time to this important topic. And I hope that the time is worthwhile as we wrestle together. The topic that I'm looking at today is, why would a loving God allow suffering? And I want to begin by sharing a story from a friend I had when I was doing my undergrad. I remember him sharing with me one time what it was like years before when his mother had died. And he explained to me that before his mom died, he saw life as something like an ocean of happiness with islands of sadness. Life was mostly a happy thing. And he said to me, since my mom has died, the situation has been the reverse. Now, more and more, life feels like an ocean of sadness, and there are still moments of joy, but those moments of joy feel more like islands. And I think right away that shows how this question, on the one hand, can be an intellectual one, and on the other hand, it can be a question of the heart. I think all of us begin, in a way, aware intellectually that suffering exists. We know that one day we will die. Maybe if we think about it, we realize that every relationship we have in life will end one day, and will end in pain. Even if we take the most happy family at the dinner table, if we think about it, one person at that table will have to watch each other member of that family die. We can know these things intellectually, but as my friend was sharing, something different happens when we start to live through these things. And I understand there may be many of you today who are currently living through something like that, a kind of awful suffering. And so this question for you is not just intellectual. And so because it has these two elements, the question, it's intellectual, it's a question of the heart. This is a challenge to talk about in 23 minutes that I have left. But I think it is also fitting for us to speak on both these things and to bring God into the picture. And that is because I am a Christian, and I do believe that the Christian faith speaks to both of these questions. I think it gives us robust answers to the intellectual questions we have about suffering, but I do also think it uniquely addresses the questions of the heart. So my talk will be divided in two. I'm going to begin looking at the intellectual question, because we have to at least acknowledge it. But at the end, I want to address how do we actually face the suffering that we go through. All right, I want to begin with the problem of evil as it is often classically formulated. For a time, this was presented as a knockdown proof against Christianity and other religions that believe in God. Has three parts. Look, if God is all-powerful, that means he could stop suffering. If God is all-loving, that means he would stop suffering. And yet there is suffering, therefore such a God does not exist. The question is right to assume that the God of the Bible is a loving God. In Christianity, God is not just loving. God is loving in Islam and other religions. But in Christianity, God is uniquely love. God exists in three persons. The Bible presents Father, Son, and Spirit, all as God in this eternal relationship of love between one another. And the creation of the world is out of that relationship of love. Human beings are made in God's image, and they are invited into that loving relationship with God. So it is right and fair to make the assumption that God is loving, and then to look out at the world and see the suffering and ask, this seems incongruent. How can this work? If there was someone in the front of the room here who was suffering and I did nothing about it, you would assume either I was unable to help or that I just didn't care for that person. So this is a fair question to ask about the Christian faith. Having said that, this was first maybe presented maybe most famously by David Hume in the 1700s. Since his time, this is no longer seen as a knock-dead argument against God's existence. And I want to explain to you two reasons why that's the case. The first relates to the basis on which we call suffering evil to begin with. So here is a well-known atheist named Richard Dawkins. Here is what he has to say as an atheist about evil and suffering. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In a way, atheism seems to deal well with the problem of suffering. It just says, this is the way reality is, get used to it. But at the same time, there's something about atheism, by rejecting the idea of God or a transcendent moral standard, that has trouble saying that suffering itself is something morally objectionable. Atheism has trouble saying that suffering in itself should be something we change and we care about, because the question becomes, where does the should come in? From perspectives of Christianity and other religions that believe in a God, you have this basis of moral goodness that exists outside of space and time, from which we can decide what is right and wrong. The Christian faith gives us a framework by which we can say, suffering shouldn't be the way it is. But atheism struggles to have that foundation. Dawkins himself admits there is no basis for calling suffering evil. It can be inconvenient, but it can't actually be objectionable. And I want to share with you a story of someone who wrestled with this question as a Christian. Andrea Palpant-Dilley is her name. She wrote this book called Faith in Flat Tires. She grew up as a missionary kid in Kenya. And living in a slum in Nairobi, she saw suffering to a degree that most of us will never see in our life. And as a teenager, she became an atheist. But she explains in the book how when she got to university and was around other atheists, she realized that many of these atheists were making the arguments that people like Richard Dawkins were making, that in the end, as atheists, they have to embrace there was no such thing as good and evil. And she reacted very strongly against this because she felt, look, the whole part of my childhood that my life is based on, why I've rejected God, is because I saw evil and was so convinced that it was evil that I couldn't believe in God anymore. How can I now reject that evil is something that doesn't exist? And it ended up being something that brought her back to faith. Here's what she says. When people ask me what drove me out of the doors of the church and then what brought me back, my answer to both questions is the same. I left the church in part because I was mad at God about human suffering and injustice. And I came back to church because of that same struggle. To talk about justice, you have to talk about objective morality. And to talk about objective morality, you have to talk about God. For Andrea, in a strange way, the conviction that suffering was real and that it was not right actually drove her to believe that God existed, because only a framework that would come from something like God could give her the basis on which to say suffering really was evil. So that's one challenge that's been raised against this simple objection to God's existence. But the next challenge that I want to share with you relates to this second premise. In a way, this again seems very straightforward. If God is loving, he would want to stop suffering. If I saw suffering and didn't want to do anything about it, I would seem not loving. But people have pointed out there are some cases where we do actually allow suffering for a greater good. When I bring my cat named Hugo to the vet, I know he's going to get something poked into him that he's not going to like. And I could sit down with Hugo and say, now Hugo, let me tell you, this is ultimately for your good. It's going to prevent further evil, further harm in the future. But that probably won't get me very far. And that's probably not my fault. There's a sense in which I have a difference of being between me and the cat that I can't convey the reasons why he's going to suffer. And in the same way, could it be that if there is a God, that God is of such a different kind of being from us, that God is not able to communicate to us the reasons why we are suffering? But that doesn't mean that there aren't any possible reasons that God might have. If I am that much greater than a cat, and God is that much greater than me, surely it must be possible that God might know things that I do not. And so this has no longer been like a knockdown proof against religion. It raises the question, though, do we have any insight? Sure, theoretically, God might have reasons, but do we have any insight as to what those reasons could possibly be, because the suffering around us is so great? And here I want to suggest that there are a couple that we might point to and say, maybe these are reasons why God would allow suffering. There's an image here that's a little hard to see, but it's of this really pretty park, and there's a church there, and this is where I asked my wife to marry me. I didn't do it in a super dramatic way, but I did get down on one knee, and I did pour out my heart to her, and she did say yes. But I did not do that while holding a gun in my hand, pointing at her. Will you marry me? Of course I'll marry you. I did not do that, and that is because in order for her to genuinely say yes to me, she had to have the ability to genuinely say no. And in the same way, if we're thinking about a God who is wanting to have a relationship with us, if that is what has driven God from the beginning to create each and one of us as human beings, we have to ask ourselves, what are the conditions that would have been necessary for God to have that kind of relationship with us? And the reality is, if I can't have a relationship with my spouse without her having the chance to say no to me, the question becomes, how could God have a relationship with us without giving us the chance to say no to him? People raise the question in the Garden of Eden, why did God create the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why did he have the prohibition against it? Why even bring that into the picture if Eden was already perfect? But I think it actually is quite intuitive that if God had given Adam and Eve 1,000 ways to say yes to him and all of the fruit and things that he'd given them to enjoy, he had nonetheless to give them one way at least to say no. And the Bible says this, in effect, is what has happened, that God has given us the chance to say no to him, and we saw in Adam and Eve that they did. They preferred to live the way they wanted to on their own terms and pushed God out of the picture. And if you know the Bible story, you will know that this is where, in the Bible's perspective, suffering enters into the world. And we see this suffering at different levels of brokenness. There's brokenness between Adam and Eve, as Adam turns to blame Eve right away for what's happened. We see a kind of suffering that exists between Adam and Eve and themselves. They experience shame. We have the first instance of what we might call mental health erosion happening here in this scene. There's brokenness even between humans and creation, as thorns suddenly begin to grow, childbirth becomes painful for Eve. And there's a way in which, if we just stop here, I think it's very intuitive to say the rippling effects of this that Christians say we have in the world, we tend to see. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr said, the doctrine of original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith. We look out and we see this brokenness on all of these levels. But there is a level of brokenness that the Bible talks about that not everyone today accepts, which is that the greatest kind of brokenness that happened here was actually between humans and God. And that brokenness was seen through Adam and Eve the moment they had turned their back on God, feeling the need to hide. And this is something that's relevant to our question. Because this would say that the condition we've inherited from Adam and Eve is actually that we are naturally in a state of spiritual suffering. The book of Ephesians speaks of our suffering as spiritual deadness, that we are walking in sins and trespasses. Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden. Walking has a leisurely sense. God was a part of their life. But now Paul says we walk, in a sense, in a leisurely way in rejecting God. We are fundamentally oriented away from God. Instead, Paul says we follow the course of the world. We value things like career and relationships and family. We turn to those things for meaning in life. But the Bible speaks of this in terms of a symptom of the break that happened between us and God. And Paul ultimately says we are therefore under God's wrath. Not everyone believes this today, but think with me for a moment if you disagree. If that were to be the case, if our current status before God was not merely imperfect people, but rebels against him, would the most loving thing for God to do be to simply make us happy? If maybe our happiness would simply blind us to this true, deeper condition that would one day result in separation from him forever? C.S. Lewis pointed out that maybe one of the reasons why God has allowed suffering is because suffering has this ability to wake us up. It wakes us up to see that things that we thought of as things that would always be there in our lives, whether relationships or a career or success or health, actually aren't things that will last forever. Lewis spoke about pain as God's megaphone to wake up a sleeping world. And Tim Keller puts this in his own way. He was a pastor in New York City, just died a couple years ago, this year. He says, "It's an exaggeration to say that no one finds God unless suffering comes into their lives, but it is not a big one. When pain and suffering come upon us, we finally see not only we are not in control of our lives, but that we never were." Sometimes people are driven away from God by suffering. But what Keller is saying is that suffering also has this potential to bring people to him. As we realize other things we put our life on start to fall through, and we look for something that will actually last. And maybe if God is loving, and if this is our real condition, allowing suffering, if it has this effect of driving us to him, maybe that is the kind of thing a loving God perhaps might allow. But I want to stop here and say, if that's the end of the story, if we're just conjecturing here about a theoretical God theoretically allowing suffering, I personally would find that lacking, and I would have trouble being a Christian. But I think there's more to the story that I want to turn to now. And that is that when we ask why would God allow suffering, sometimes we think of God merely as sitting back and doing nothing. But the Christian faith says that is not the case, that God has done something. Maybe you know that image of Christianity is a cross. At the very heart of our faith is a symbol of suffering. And as I was preparing for this talk, I thought about how, in a way, everything that God has done in his involvement in the world, that the Bible talks about, could be spoken of as addressing the problem of evil. This problem matters to you. It matters to God very much. I don't know if there's a problem that matters more to God than this very one we're talking about. And it matters to God so much that he has done three things at least. The first thing he has done is he has entered into our suffering. In Islam, the idea of God becoming a man, the Quran says, is a thing most monstrous. In Islam, for a prophet to suffer is something that God would simply not allow. That's why in the Quran, Jesus doesn't even die on the cross. But in Christianity, we have not only God becoming man, with all the sufferings that normally come with being a human, involving Jesus loses one of his close friends in his lifetime. He suffers physically. But his suffering physically is actually far more intense. It is a messy death. He dies on a cross in a publicly humiliating way. And no other religion suggests that God would suffer willingly like this. And this is not nothing. Often when we go through intense suffering, we don't actually want reasons for why we're suffering. We just want someone who's there with us, and especially someone who's been through the same thing as we have. And the God of the Bible offers you that. He is a God who has suffered. But the Bible says God hasn't just suffered with us, he's also suffered for us. The Bible speaks of God dying for our sins. And this is, again, where people today say, I like the idea of God, I like the idea of Jesus suffering for us, that's nice and loving, but this idea that Jesus bore our sins on the cross, I don't buy that. But I want to ask, does it make sense that Jesus' death is loving if his death was not for us? What do I mean? There's an illustration from Tim Keller that, again, I find helpful. I'll share it with you applied to Toronto. Let's say after this talk today, we go down to the water. I know that's kind of far. We would be very cold when we got there. But let's say we're feeling like we want to go on a walk, and as we're walking, I'm chatting with some of you, getting to know you, and I say, I've really gotten to enjoy being with you all, and I have come to care for you very much. And I want to show you my love for you right now. And I jump into the freezing water, I swim out as far as I can, and I drown. Are you guys going to look at each other and say, wow, he loved us so much? No, that is not loving. You're going to say, this person is crazy. I can't believe I gave 23 minutes to listen to this person. Why didn't I see this before? The only way my death could become loving is maybe if you fell in the water and I jumped in to save you. I saved you, but I drowned. Would that death become loving? Yes. And in the same way, Jesus' death on the cross can only be an act of love for us if we were in a situation of danger that his death has rescued us from. And the Bible says that is the case for us. If God has to address the problem of suffering, it would make sense he would address the problem where the suffering is the worst. And that's what the Bible says God has done by dying on the cross. Our greatest suffering was this separation from him that had eternal consequences. That was worse than the physical pain we can feel here and now. And God has dealt with that on the cross so that now if we put our faith in him, we can be made right with him and that relationship can be restored. God cares about suffering. He suffers with us. He suffers for us. And lastly, he rises from the dead. And this, from the Bible's perspective, sets in motion the restoration of all things. Jesus is the forerunner of the new creation, where all of us will one day have no more suffering. God himself will wipe our tears away. All injustices will be made right. And just as I close, I want to acknowledge here that many of you know all of this. Maybe you're saying, the pizza was okay, it was cold out, long walk, and I know this kind of thing. Maybe if you're not a Christian, you've at least heard that Christianity has this story of a cross and a resurrection. But I want to now get a little more practical and ask, what does all this mean for when we have to face suffering? acknowledging that there are many people here, I imagine, who are suffering now. And I want to first point out that we have to compare what Christianity says, especially to what secularism says about suffering. Ever since the modern period, secularism's approach to suffering is really focused on getting rid of suffering. When the pandemic hits, the first recourse we have is not to think about our souls, but to think about a vaccine. When we go through a medical trial, our first recourse is to think about the doctor who's going to help us. When we face mental health challenges, we want to get better. These are obviously good things. It's an approach to suffering that says, how can we fix this problem? But what's missing from the modern world that the ancient world always had was a way to look at suffering and say, even if we can't get rid of this, it still has some redemptive value. For Aristotle, suffering had this role of making us more virtuous. But in the modern world, when we look at suffering, when we come to suffering that we can't get rid of, it becomes very difficult for us to see any good in it at all. And in one point, of course, we will all die. So there's a sense in which suffering will inevitably be something no matter what treatment we do can fix. But I want to suggest that Christianity offers an answer for facing suffering, even when that suffering doesn't go away. Again, this is a dark image here, but it is an image of a furnace. The Bible speaks of suffering like a forge or a furnace. And maybe you know, if a forge, when it's heated up, is dangerous. And you can throw some things in a forge and it will burn it up completely. But there are other things you can throw in a forge that will then become refined. And there's actually a story in the Bible about 3 men who face a literal furnace. It's in the Old Testament. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are Jewish exiles living in Babylon in the 6th century. They refused to bow down to a golden image that the king had set up for them to worship. And the king, in his wrath, sets this punishment and says he will throw them into a fiery furnace. And basically, verse 16, I'm just going to read it to you. Here's what we read. The king gives them one chance to change their mind, and they say, "O king, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." The king gets furious. He heats the furnace up 7 times hotter than normal. He has them thrown into the furnace. The guards who threw them in, it's so hot, the guards die. And this seems to be where the story ends. And I want to just notice quickly, I think there are 3 things. How do these people face this kind of suffering? I think they turn to 3 things, and there are 3 things that are here for us. The first is that they acknowledge that someone is in control, and that someone is God. They say, I might die, I might live, but there is a God who's in control. A friend of mine in university had her sister, her best friend, die in a car accident. And I remember after this happened, she would keep saying, God is sovereign, God is sovereign. And I remember pulling her aside and saying, why do you keep saying that? It sort of sounds as if you think God himself, caused this directly instead of just allowing it. And she said, no, that's not what I'm saying. But she's saying, my whole life, ever since this happened, has been just feeling like nothing is in control, that it's just, I'm in this whirlwind where nothing is up and nothing is down, and I have no idea what's going on. The only thing that holds me steady is just believing that there is someone in control. Now, that really depends on the character of the person who's in control. But as a friend of mine liked to say, if you are pushed to your limits, the real you comes out. And when God is pushed to his limits, surely that would have been on the cross. And if what comes out of Jesus in that moment as he's dying for us is love for those dying next to him, love for those reviling him, if he was love on the cross, that means he is love for us now, even if we don't possibly see how he could be loving in our suffering. What galvanized these 3 was, on the one hand, this sense that though everything seemed like the bottom had fallen out, there was someone loving who was holding them together. That was powerful for them. The second thing, quickly, is that we see that they have this ability to acknowledge their life will possibly end here, but to acknowledge that that would not be the worst thing. In other words, their suffering for them drove them to something that they knew was going to last. And in this case, we see that what they knew was going to last was that they had God. and that even if their physical bodies were killed, that they would still have God in the end. Suffering has this ability to see how things that aren't God, all of them will one day fade away. But when we have someone with us and we know where we stand with them, which the Bible says we can have when we put our trust in Jesus, we can make it through, not alone. And just lastly here, Tim Keller says, there is a purpose in our suffering, and if faced rightly, it can drive us like a nail deep into the love of God and into more stability and spiritual power than you can imagine. Maybe you know that this story ends with the king, after putting the 3 men in the fire, noticing that there is a 4th person in the fire. And the king asks, we put only 3 in there, right? And he says, here I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Under the right conditions, a forge can refine. The right conditions for making it through the suffering of life, the Bible says, is to go into your suffering with God. The 3 men are brought out of the furnace. Amazingly, they survive. God protected them. But there is here a symbol for what this means for you and me. Isaiah writes in chapter 43, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. And when you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. I don't know what the suffering furnace is that you're walking through today. If you are not walking through one, you will. We all will. But I just want to say, when that day comes, do you have someone to go in the furnace with you? Do you have the assurance of where you stand with God? Do you have the hope that whatever suffering you have in this life will not be the final word? And I just want to end by saying, I think you can. I think you can have that hope. Well, I just want to thank you. That's all I have to share. Thank you for this time. This is a heavy topic. We're in deep waters. And as was mentioned at the start, maybe we could get the slide up again. This is a time that's going to be Q&A as well. I think there'll be a couple announcements right before that. But I would really love to hear from you where this is hitting all of you. There's a website here called slido.com. Maybe someone else is going to explain this. Forgive me if I'm jumping the gun. But when you go to that website, you'll be prompted for a code. The code is there on the screen. That gives you the chance to submit a question, but it also gives you the chance to vote on other questions that have been submitted. And I just will be coming up in a moment to do Q&A, but I just want to thank you for your attention, for giving this question your thought, and I'm happy to speak to you in a moment. Thanks.
And thank you so much for Logan Gates' very touching and real message. And for now, he has already explained how the Slido is working. Much better than me explaining to you, much clearer. But now I do have 2 more programs while you are maybe writing your Slido. I have to tell you what is going on our campus. One is called Christianity Explored. That's an amazing program.
You might be a convinced atheist, a committed Christian, or somewhere in between. Perhaps you've lots of questions to ask, or perhaps you're happier just sitting and listening. Maybe you go to church, or maybe you've never been. Whoever you are, Christianity Explored is a place for you to explore what life is all about. The Christianity Explored course is free, it's relaxed and informal, and it's run by ordinary people local to you. Some courses are held in churches with lots of people. Some are held in people's houses with just a few friends getting together. Wherever you meet, in each session, there's a chance to look at the life of Jesus for yourself and ask any questions you have. There's a short video to watch, and then a chance to chat about what you've just heard. You'll meet great people. You won't be asked to sing or pray or read out loud, and you don't need to know anything about the Bible to enjoy it. So whoever you are, come and explore. There's almost certainly a Christianity Explored course starting near you soon. So ask a Christian friend, or check out the website to find out more. you might just discover that the Christian message really is the best news you've ever heard.
And we also have an Alpha course. The both course, the first one, Christianity Explorer, will start at January 25th. That's Thursday. Every Thursday night at 5:30 p.m. at Wycliffe College. This is where we are. And the second one is Alpha. It will be start at February 7th on Wednesday at Knox Presbyterian Church. And the Christianity Explorer is absolutely free. It's free, and free food will be provided. It will have a short Bible study. By watching, later on we'll watch a video and a video discussion. And you can be absolutely anxiety-free because you won't be asked to pray or sing or anything. You can just sit or listen. Yeah. So the questions we have. Thank you for having us this chance. How can I seek God in my current pain if I am not a Christian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I want to be quick to say what I said a moment ago about how secularism's response to suffering is to look to solve the suffering. I want to emphasize that that is a good impulse. And I think as Christians, we are not masochists. We do not think we should seek out suffering. It is right to seek alleviation for suffering because God has made us in such a way that we have minds to think about how we can feel better. So, if it's physical suffering, we can see a doctor. It is good and right if we are struggling with mental health challenges to speak with someone about that. So I guess it would depend on the particular pain that someone is wrestling with here. But I think I would say this. These things that I've referred to, and maybe we could also put like a good friend in this category, I think that these are wonderful things to embrace. They are things in a way we can bring into the furnace with us. But I think the reality is, even if we take someone like a great friend, what we all know, and this is something we all experience from time to time, is sometimes we put so much trust and weight and hope in a friend, and then find out in the moment we really need that person, they fall through. And I think that is an indication, again, that maybe we weren't meant to place our ultimate weight in friends to begin with. Friends are so helpful. We need them to get through life. But I think in the end, we know even friends will die, and even we will die. And so I will encourage you, even if you're at this point just thinking about suffering abstractly, not that interested in faith, I think I would just prod you gently a little bit to say that my heart would be for you that you have something to get you through this that is even more durable than a good friend. I hope you have good friends, and I hope you can share with them about that. But I think my heart for you would be to see that God is not just some spiritual reality far away that if you were ever to relate to would be nothing like a good friend. I think that actually if you speak to anyone who's a Christian, maybe part of the relevant team wearing a sweatshirt, I think you'd find that they would be people who would be glad to tell you about what it's like to actually relate to God, not just as a theory or a philosophy, but as a person who you can speak to and who meets you where you really hurt most, not just with vague theology, but with real comfort. And so that would be my heart for you if you're asking this question. But I appreciate where it's coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. How about the people who suffer through mental illness and who lack mental capacity? How are they supposed to make sense of their suffering?
Yeah. I think when we look at a particular instance of suffering, like Job in the Bible, what we find in the end is that Job does not learn the reasons why he suffers. And I think that is the case, actually, for most of us who are going through suffering. In the end, we don't get to see why God allowed such a particular thing to happen, how he could still be good, working good through that and allowing that to take place. And I think, as we've been talking about, we're on a university campus. This is quite a heady topic. And so when I think of someone who is a person with disabilities, maybe who is, we have close family friends who have children with Down syndrome and have gotten the chance to know them. That's hard. I don't have the sense that they'll be able to read textbooks on this problem and come to a clear resolution in their mind. But I think I will also say that many of them, to the extent to which they are able to think about God, even in simple terms, often blow me away with their childlike sense of conviction that there is a God, that he loves them, that he is good. And I think that when Jesus says, actually, let the children come to me, and we need faith like children, I think he's actually saying that there's a sense in which our natural default is what we began with, which is this sense of trusting that, just like we trust our parents, at least as children, that they love us. So also, and not a posture to that extent, that feeble kind of childlike faith, I think actually is a powerful thing. For someone who has no intellectual capacity to be able to grasp that kind of thing, all I can do is stand back with you and just acknowledge it is so sad. But I think I will say again, I feel the Christian faith gives me the vocabulary to look at that and say, it should not be this way, and one day it will not be, and God will make things right. And I just feel without my faith, without a theistic framework, I don't think we can say that. So I don't think atheism solves this problem. I think that Christianity does a better job recognizing it for what it is, but also giving hope.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. If God can think of a reason why suffering is for good when we can't, because he is a different being, why can't he think of a way to save us without it?
That's a great question. I think my overall answer just has to be, if this is a God who, we live on one planet, we are one creature, and if this is the God who made the stars with his fingers and is the maker of the universe, I just think that he must have reasons that I don't understand. And I think the real question behind this question is, can we trust that God is really good? That this really was the best option of all the possible worlds that he could create? And I think that question has a clear answer. Because again, if we think about how can you truly know someone's character when I'm pushed to my limits, I'm stressed and unpleasant and not good to be around, and that saying would say, who I am at those worst moments, that's who I actually am. But when we ask this question of God, what we can just see from the cross is whoever God is, if he is there on the cross, his fundamental orientation towards us must be one of the deepest love. And if he was loving there when he died for us, I think he was loving there when he made us and made the world the way he is. And so maybe if this is the last question, I'll just close with a verse that's just been on my mind. Maybe if you're in the place where this is real for you right now, and just maybe something to walk away with. There's a verse in one of the Psalms. These are these prayers in the Old Testament that often are crying out to God in pain. And the psalmist says, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge." I like this idea that it's higher than I because there's an element here that we don't understand. We don't understand why God would allow this kind of thing, this kind of world. But at the same time, there's a recognition that what we're being asked to be led to is a rock, something steady, something that lasts. And it is not only just a rock abstractly, it is a rock that has been our refuge. And my heart for you, if you're not a Christian, is I hope you consider the Christianity Explored course. But even if you don't and just are continuing your own spiritual journey, I hope that when you look at the cross, you see that God has made himself a refuge for us. And because you see what he's done for you there, I hope you can know that you can run to him now. And that would be my encouragement, is that you know that for yourself.
Thank you so much for your time and answering our questions. That's about time for our Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you. And we also encourage all of you to continue join our relevant series. We have one more day tomorrow. We have interesting topics, just like exciting us today. It's called God and Science. Please follow us. And also connect with the relevant series through our social media. We have it's all on the screen. Scan the QR code if you haven't yet do it. And also we have to acknowledge There's so many workers that's helping out the whole series. It's because of them everything is possible. We have to give thanks to the clubs we collaborate with. There are InterVersity, Chinese Christian Fellowship, Mandarin Chinese Christian Fellowship, Wycliffe College, Mission Hub, Every Nation Church, Christ the King, Power to Change, and Campus Worship. And it is about time to end this session. We are running a minute late. We give thanks for your coming, and sorry about the late. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Thank you so much. God bless you all. Have a good day.